Welcome to the 21st William G. Demas Lecture. This is the first event of the 51st annual meeting of the Caribbean Development Bank. My name is Camille Taylor. I'm Head of Corporate Communications at the CDB, and I will be moderating the proceedings. The William G. Demas Lecture Series was inaugurated in the year 2000 in honor of the CDB's second president, who was renowned for his expertise as an economist. He rendered distinguished service to the region, serving in several pivotal positions, including Secretary General of CARICOM, Governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, and Chancellor of the University of Guyana. For the past 2 decades, these lectures have disseminated the ideas of distinguished scholars, practitioners, and professionals on a wide cross-section of development issues and topics of high significance and interest to the region. This year will be no different, as we will hear from one of the world's most influential economists, Professor Mariana Mazzucato. Our speaker is a professor in the economics of innovation and public value at University College London, UCL. She serves as the founding director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She is a winner of international prizes, including the 2000 John von Neumann Award, the 2019 All-European Academy's Madame de Staël Prize for Cultural Values, and the 2018 Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought. She was named one of the 3 most important thinkers about innovation by the New Republic, one of the 50 most creative people in business in 2020 by Fast Company, and one of the 25 leaders shaping the future of capitalism by Wired. She is the author of 3 highly acclaimed books: The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths, The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the Global Economy, and the newly released Mission Economy, a moonshot guide to changing capitalism. The overall theme of the CDB's 51st annual meeting is innovation, transformation, and sustainable development. By design, innovation is the first element in that equation, because for us at CDB, it's not simply a buzzword, it's a call to action, and we are sounding it to the entire region. The time is now. And so we invite Professor Mazzucato to lay the framework for what we hope will be a far-reaching discussion. It is therefore both a privilege and a pleasure to invite Professor Mariana Mazzucato to deliver the 21st William G. Demas Lecture. Professor?
So much. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here today, and I'm especially looking forward to the discussion. So I'm going to try to do my lecture quite quickly so we can get to the real meat of the matter. And really what I want to be focusing on is that we have to absolutely, at this really crisis moment, multiple crisis moment in the history of capitalism, go beyond the usual ideology, whether it's private sector, public sector, what should the public sector do, which market failure should it fix, but actually really develop a different framing that can then be useful, hopefully, for development banks, for innovation agencies, for city level agencies that actually care about what you've just said, Camille, which is innovation, transformation, sustainable development, but also to really do it in such a way that is truly goal-oriented. We have these 17 sustainable development goals, and we're simply not achieving them. So what does it actually mean to take the goals seriously and put them at the center of our economy? But also, you just used a really important word, design. How can we design our institutions like development banks so they actually have the SDGs and the goals underneath them? Because there's 169 targets below the SDGs at their core. What does it mean in terms of not just handing out money, not just obsessing about categories like SMEs, but actually obsessing about the goal and then getting every part of our economy to catalyze and to work together towards actually achieving them. So I'm going to now share my screen. This is always the dangerous bit where you risk sharing your emails. Here we go. I hope you see the screen. I'm quite lucky to be able to speak to you today, having just launched this book. And what I'm really looking forward to, as I mentioned, is to talk to Dr. Leon and to others on the floor with the Q&A about what the implications are actually for small island development states. So first of all, we are all globally, I'm here in London, we are all around the world currently living through this really tragic moment of a health pandemic. And to turn it into an opportunity actually means to learn the lessons of just how terribly we have dealt with this crisis. And you can look at so many different aspects of it, which is the way that we kind of failed to provide globally personal protection equipment to frontline workers, how test and trace systems just did not, work as well as they could, and also they weren't necessarily governed. The digital divide, so many students globally have not accessed their human right to education in this period because of the digital divide, but also the vaccine. We just had the G7 meeting, we're going to have the G20 meeting in the autumn, but just read the papers and listen to Dr. Tedros at the World Health Organization. He says we have vaccine apartheid. We have 80% of the vaccines currently being hoarded by 10% of the country. So this is in no way a good report card of how we have globally, dealt with this crisis. So what can we learn from it? I'm going to be talking a lot about that in terms of what can we learn in terms of the design of our institutions, the design of our partnerships, in order that the next pandemic is actually handled in a fundamentally different way. But before that, again, this crisis comes on the back of course, multiple crises, economic and financial crises that we seem to continually experience no matter where we live around the world, but also the climate crisis. And we needed a 16-year-old, Greta Thunberg from Sweden to remind us all that, what do you do when your house is on fire? Do you sit there and debate? What should I do? No, you get out. And we are not getting out of this crisis, the global warming crisis, which of course, small island development states are incredibly vulnerable towards fast enough. We had the IPCC report in 2019 telling us we had 10 years left. And if you look at all the data, I just have some of this here in front of you, we are again not moving at speed. Even the COVID-19 recovery funds, a very large amount of them continue to go towards energy companies that continue to be based on fossil fuel. And what's interesting though is that we also have a lot of talk in the business community, and it's a really important talk, but we need to turn it into a walk of changing corporate governance. So it truly is purpose oriented. And I'm going to be coming back to this notion of purpose and what it actually means to walk the talk of purpose and walk the talk of stakeholder value. But basically, the reason this is so important is that we can't rely just on the state or just on business, right? We need to actually look also within our organizations and ask, do we have the right kind of organization in order to confront the challenges? So if we have companies that, for example, continue to be too wed to short-termism, to just value, their share prices and engage in massive share buyback schemes like we've seen in the last 10 years, where over 4 trillion, that's 12 zeros, $4 trillion have been spent just to buy back shares by the S&P 500 companies. That's not necessarily the kind of corporate governance that we're going to need in order, again, to solve the kind of challenges that we have ahead. So this talk about stakeholder value, which is very important, is all about changing that obsession about shareholder value towards, actually sharing, if you want, the rewards of company growth, which a much wider group of stakeholders. But I believe that needs to be much more, focused. It's not just about sharing the wealth. It's actually about creating that wealth in the first place in a more collective way. Stakeholder value has to eventually actually make us realize that the only way to address the kind of challenges, whether it's climate or the health pandemic, we actually need multiple stakeholders to be investing, to be innovating, and taking care actually to structure those relationships in such a way that truly is stakeholder driven. It's not just about pretending that value is created in the business community and then we need to share that wealth with more people. It's about collectively creating that wealth in a fundamentally new way. And one of the things I've been arguing about for quite a long time is that it's not just that we have problems in the corporate community in terms of governance. We have actually true problems within the state and different types of public entities in terms of how they are governed. And at worst, we're told that the state is not needed. That if you're on a bus, there's something wrong with you. That was the famous quote by Margaret Thatcher. But of course, that whole kind of Reagan and Thatcherite period of some ways decimating actually state capacity. That's kind of the bad part of the story. But even the good part of the story, where we talk about, of course, we need public action, we need public investment, austerity is bad, we have tended to then still frame the role of the state in this very lame kind of inertial way as though at best all it can do is fix different types of market failures. So by definition, our state structures, whether it's a public bank, whether again it's an innovation agency, whether it's a Department of Health, doesn't have within its remit this more proactive framing that I believe we need in order to confront the challenges we have, which I call co-creating and co-shaping of markets, not just fixing them. Because otherwise, even something like the public good, it sounds good, the second word is good, but if it's just framed as kind of filling the gap of something that the private sector is not doing, it doesn't actually then embed within it on a design level that kind of common good objective. So transforming public goods towards common goods from corrections towards objectives actually requires a different design of what we think the state is for. And what was interesting, at least in the UK, where again I'm living now, is that both on the back of Brexit and of COVID, there was this realization, and this picture here is of Lord Agnew, a Tory lord in the UK government, that we had outsourced basically the capacity of the state too much to consulting companies, too much to the private sector. So it's not only that we should go beyond the kind of dichotomy of public versus private, but we really need to also be building within all the different institutions, private and public, dynamic capabilities and capacity. And otherwise, what he argued was this outsourcing, the consultification to the McKinseys of the world of government capacity was infantilizing what Whitehall. And that also reminded me of something that Obama said when he was still president of the United States. He said, we live and do business in the information age, and we talk about the knowledge economy and the digital revolution, but the last major reorganization of the government happened in the age of black and white TV. And I think there isn't really a coincidence here. This is the natural outcome of actually thinking that our public institutions aren't actually really important. They don't create value, they simply redistribute it. They don't create and shape markets, they just fix market failures. They don't take risks, they're there to de-risk someone else. Why should you invest within government institutions and public sector capacity if you're just there to pick up the mess? And again, COVID-19, big wake-up moment in terms of the much-needed dynamic capabilities in both private and public and third sectors, and to be able to actually work together towards solving problems. And I recently actually co-authored a paper with Achim Steiner, the head of UNDP, on this issue of just all the learning of the need to develop the capacity and the capabilities to adapt and learn, to align public services and citizen needs, to govern resilient production systems, and especially to govern data and digital platforms towards the common good. But what I want to talk about in my kind of second half of the talk here is that, there's something that was really interesting that, humans did 51 years ago, which is incredibly hard, much harder than delivering personal protection equipment to frontline workers, which again, we failed miserably and tragically. We got a man, and at the time it was a man, it was 2/3 men who tried, to the moon and back. And that was not only extremely hard, but it required a huge amount of innovation and investment by multiple parts of the economy. It was not just aeronautics, it was also investment in innovation in areas like nutrition, materials, electronics. The whole software industry in some ways can be seen as a result of that. But it also required huge change within government. A purpose-led organization like NASA that led the way needed actually to change its organization, change its culture, change the way it actually thought about the civil service in order to do that. And if you look back at that speech, or the different speeches that Kennedy gave in the early 1960s, he was very clear that actually, going to the moon meant being willing to experiment, to do trial and error. He said it was going to cost a lot of money, but that it was worth it, that it would cause all sorts of different types of developments on Earth. And he was absolutely right. But he also said things like, we have to do it because it's hard, not because it's easy. And imagine actually hearing, politicians talk like that. We need to fight climate change because it's hard, not because it's easy. And to be honest, many of the challenges that I'm sure we'll talk about during the discussion, and I've already mentioned the SDGs, which very, kind of broadly define some of the biggest challenges we have ahead. That's actually harder than getting to the moon. These are wicked challenges. These are challenges that require social change, political change, regulatory change, behavioral change, and of course, technological, social, and organizational change. But we we have to at least admit they are hard. We will confront them in a way that actually will require us to welcome uncertainty, to be willing to experiment, to invest in our ability to learn by doing. It's not enough to say, don't worry, you can fail. How do you learn from those attempts at doing something and actually invest within your own capacity to learn? And in those early days, they had no idea how to get to the moon, right? So, you know, they said we're going to get there and back in one generation, but there was all sorts of different ways. They finally landed on this lunar orbit rendezvous way. But the fact that they actually even bothered trying something where the risk was so high, it would have stopped day one had they evaluated it based on cost-benefit analysis or net present value calculations, which we tend to today evaluate any sort of, public investment, both ex ante and ex post. And what was really interesting also on that fatal day, on January 27th, 1967, on the day of the Apollo fire, was that, they couldn't hear what was being said to them inside the simulation of the lunar module. And Gus Grissom, one of the astronauts who later died, he, was saying, how are we going to get to the moon when we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? So that, the silos that so many different governments have between different departments, the lack of horizontal communication, the lack of agility and flexibility within our public structures, this is a central thing to change if we do want a purpose-oriented a public service and public organization, whether, again, it's a public bank or any other entity. And in fact, George Mueller ended up coming in from Bell Labs to restructure NASA in this way with different project managers, teams underneath them. But the main thing was to nurture that kind of horizontal, again, constant communication and learning between the different teams. And lots of different things happened along the way. There was huge amounts of investment in innovation in companies as different as Honeywell, Motorola, General Electric, also some small and medium companies, which ended up innovating in all sorts of different areas like camera phones, athletic shoes, foil blankets, and so on. But what was interesting was they weren't obsessing on that technology, right? Those technologies, those innovations came about as solutions to problems along the way. And this is a really important point. Instead of, today thinking about digital, we need to invest in digitalization, we need to invest in quantum computing or AI or particular types of technologies, focusing on the problem, where then the solutions to those problems actually have technology and technological and organizational innovations as spillovers of a purpose-oriented process, is, again, a really important lesson. And here, too, a lot of these spillovers were dynamic spillovers along the way towards achieving a public goal, again, very much directed by the government, but with lots of bottom-up experimentation. And here, too, we need to ask ourselves, do we have metrics today that actually allow us to capture, to value the dynamic spillovers along the way to actually fulfilling a mission? Again, if we just have these very static types of metrics around cost benefit and net present value, it's much harder. And also what was so interesting to me when I was writing this book and looking at some of the background literature is that NASA really cared to partner with the private sector in an ambitious way that really was full of confidence. They even had a no excess profits clause. The idea that this was truly a collective endeavor. They were going to then share their rewards collectively instead of allowing space to become what one could argue it is today, which is a gambling casino. They also really cared to design procurement policy and all their different instruments like grants and loans to foster as much bottom-up innovation in the private sector. So again, government-led, but lots of catalytic innovation from below. And that meant they had to scrap the way that procurement used to be done through cost plus contracting, where just, costs would just be inflated artificially, towards fixed price contracts, almost like prize schemes, but then with constant incentives for quality improvement and innovation. And that precisely, that care to design the procurement in such a way that focused on the goal, but then really fostered as much bottom-up innovation, had a lot to do with why those spillovers came about. And they also, this was so interesting, the head of procurement in NASA at the time was called Ernest Brackett. He was very aware of that problem that Lord Agnew just called out last year with COVID-19. He said, if we ourselves within the public sector stop investing in our brain, in our own, what I call dynamic capabilities of the public sector, we won't even know how to partner with the private sector. We won't know how to write the terms of reference. So he said, we have to be investing in our capabilities, otherwise we'll get captured, he said, by brochuremanship. today we have nice PowerPoints. At the time, there were sexy brochures that businesses would bring in. And so in order for NASA to know, which were the top businesses to be working with, and also how to negotiate good contracts, how to make sure that these contracts were designed in such a way to foster value creation and not value extraction, they had to themselves be investing within their public sector brain. And yes, it costs a lot of money, but Kennedy was very careful to remind people that it was going to cost less than what we spend on cigars and cigarettes. But, we need to go beyond just the numbers. It was really the fact that there was a dynamic system of innovation, lots of different actors, and so much attention was paid to all these different areas that I just mentioned, which then allowed the multiplier effect, right? For every dollar spent, it actually had a huge spillover in the economy, creating all those catalytic dynamic spillovers, which precisely allowed a higher multiplier effect. So I just want to end by saying that I think, even though we know that the SDGs and our social goals around inequality and climate and so on are actually harder in many ways than going to the moon, these lessons are very important. And I think perhaps with the discussion, we can talk about this framing that I call a mission-oriented approach, and why it's so important to today's innovation policy and industrial strategy, precisely to get away from this idea that you just need to make a list of kind of sectors and competitive areas one wants to invest in. What does it mean to have a challenge-oriented approach, a purpose-oriented approach, a mission-oriented approach, where we focus on the problems? So if you just start with the SDGs, these are our grand challenges, turn them into missions, which are as concrete as getting to the moon and back, so you can actually answer, did we do it? Did we not? But designing it so it brings as many different sectors to the table as possible. And then designing the procurement policies, the loans, the grants to foster that bottom-up experimentation. So here were two examples that I worked through with the European Commission. So if you take the clean oceans, which of course is so important in terms of the kind of blue economy in small island development states, turn it into a very concrete mission, like getting the plastic out over a concrete amount of time. That, of course, is going to require all sorts of different sectors, from chemicals to biotech to waste to design, AI, marine, and so on. And lots of different projects will be needed in terms of almost the homework problems that need to be solved along the way. Similarly, with climate change, what does it mean to be very ambitious in terms of carbon neutral cities by a certain time period? All sorts of different sectors, from real estate, new forms of insurance, construction, mobility, food, and so on. And again, those bottom-up projects. In terms of industrial strategy, one thing that I learned recently was just how useful actually this framing was for countries like the UK, but many countries which just had lists of sectors. In the UK, those sectors were life sciences, the creative sector, financial services, automobiles, and aerospace. To do what? So if you say scrap the sectors, worry about your big challenges, and they chose clean growth, the data economy, future of mobility, the aging society, and turn those into missions. Right, so the future of mobility, having a mission, let me see here, the writing is tiny, to have a sustainable, universally accessible travel, creating congestion and emission-free, zero accident systems. This was a very ambitious mission. You can imagine that some of those bottom-up projects will also be coming from areas like the disabilities community, given the need to have 100% accessible travel, for example, in the public transport system. So again, focusing on the challenge, turning it into a mission, and getting so many different sectors around transport, robotics, the creative sector, inclusive design, and so on, working together to fulfill the goal. And I really, in reading some of the literature that has been written by UNIDO and others on small island development states, I think this is a very natural place in some ways to test this framework around, the very important objectives around sustainable energy, climate change, oceans and seas, and the whole blue economy area, but also looking at the digital economy, not as like a sector, but in some ways a general purpose technology, which is going to be absolutely crucial across all those different challenge areas. And in terms of the missions themselves, one of the things that I learned in working, for example, with Sweden, where they had school level missions, right? Getting schools to deliver sustainable, healthy, and tasty school meals to children, was also, what does it mean to bring communities, in this case, school children, to the table to actually design those very missions, to really co-create them from the start. This is, again, something very different from the moon landing, which was, of course, very top down. But the modern day missions need, citizen also co-creation. And And there's also, like in Camden Council, Camden is a part of London where I live, we're focusing, for example, also on youth centers. What does it mean to turn youth centers into the best that the 21st century can offer? So place-based strategies where missions around particular targets that we're trying to reach for youth, who many have been really disenfranchised in recent years from particular communities, putting the places like public libraries, youth centers, community centers at the center where all these different sectors come together to deliver different types of missions. Some of the work, and sorry, I'm about to finish because I think I've got 1 minute left. Some of the work we've also done is to ask, what does it also mean for the design of the institutions on the ground? So some of the work I did in Scotland, for example, in helping to set up a whole new public bank that didn't exist before, was what does it mean to have a mission-oriented bank, which is providing patient, long-term, committed finance to those organizations that are willing to work with the government around its missions. And one of Scotland's big missions at the time when we were working was in digitalizing its health system, and really kind of increasing the capacity of the health system itself. Instead of just getting handed an app, say from Google, investing in the digital capacity of the government and also of the NHS in particular to deliver on particular goals it had. So instead of picking winners, picking the willing, instead of making a list of sectors, bringing in all sorts of different actors in the public, private, and the third sector to work with governments and to provide that lending to those organizations that are willing and able to actually tackle these challenges. We also work closely with the European Investment Bank. If it wants to be a climate bank, as it calls itself, what does it mean, again, for the types of loans and grants it gives? And by the way, just before I finish, one of the things I found so interesting in Germany, for example, was that the loans that were provided, if we just go back to that question of a public bank, to the steel sector, which in Germany, like in so many different countries, has been asking for help because it's in trouble. Because Germany actually had a high-level mission, the Energiewende mission, it used that to structure the loans that were given to steel with conditionality. The steel sector had to lower its material content in order to access the public loan. And they did it through repurpose, reuse, recycle technologies through their entire value chain, and became one of the most innovative, sustainable steel sectors in the world, not because they went to Davos to talk about purpose, but because they had to in order to access that loan. And that comes to what Camille was talking about, the focus on transformation, using public banks to lend out money with conditions attached to transformation towards public goals. I already mentioned quickly the Swedish mission. My last slide here is really just to reflect on this need also to redesign the social contract between the public and the private sector. And I mentioned that in the beginning. And I think one really interesting thing that we've learned with COVID-19, I've already mentioned some, is the opportunity really to put conditionalities at the center of recovery schemes, of bailout schemes. So this is the picture here of the French minister who said to both Renault, the car manufacturer, and Air France, that in order to access the COVID-19 recovery in France, they had to commit to lowering their carbon emissions. Or in Denmark and Austria, commit to not using tax havens. And here's a picture of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's been arguing for some time. We actually spoke together 3 years ago about this, that this is also really needed at the center of health innovation. We cannot continue just to think that you can just invest in R&D and health innovation without then structuring the intellectual property rights in such a way that truly reflects that collective creation, to make sure that citizens whose tax, is helping to create the drugs also can benefit from those drugs, both in terms of affordability, but also that the intellectual property rights don't get kind of abused along the way. And that's important, of course, because patents are contracts, right? So how do you get a proper deal, a dynamic, symbiotic, mutualistic deal, and not a parasitic deal? And this really requires governing innovation, governing production in such a way that has that common good at the center. The city of Barcelona recently did something interesting where they brought in hackers into the city team, into the city innovation team, in order to make sure that as data is created in society, every time we click on our city mapper or any technology, the city itself is able to govern the use of that data production, its understanding of data, in order to improve public transport and public housing. And they actually brought in hackers to be a public service, public servants, but also this notion of the data commons, again, coming back to this notion of the common good, is required also in terms of thinking through the kinds of skills that we need in city governments. But here too, a very different relationship between public and private, not just worrying ex post about privacy and taxation, but also ex ante in a pre-distribution kind of way. How do we govern also the ownership of data and a kind of non-intermediated way in which it can benefit citizens? And this is my last slide, just to say this really does, I think, require new storytelling, a new narrative of what government is for, what public organizations are for, moving away from fixing towards co-creating, moving away from purely de-risking towards welcoming uncertainty and investing in our capacity to deal with complexity and uncertainty, away from picking winners, just random lists of projects and sectors, which can get captured quite easily, towards picking the willing, away from leveling the playing field towards tilting towards a direction and using a portfolio approach to do that, not putting all our eggs in one basket, away from outsourcing government capacity towards actually capacity building, and really also reflecting on this need of having dynamic valuation metrics, both before asking what is it we're trying to do. We're trying to not just fix a market, but create one, but also ex post, that notion of dynamic spillovers and how important it is to not just get wed to these very static notions of cost benefit and net present value. So I'm not sure how to come back to you all. I don't know if you still see my screen.
Thank you, Professor. So with that initial presentation, Professor Mazzucato, you have, as we say in this region, set the wicket. And that is the foundation for a deeper discussion as we now relate the issues that the professor raised to the Caribbean context. For this segment, Professor Mazzucato will be joined by President of the Caribbean Development Bank, Dr. Jean Leon, and also by Mr. Ashley Singh, Minister of Finance and CDB Governor for Guyana. Professor, President, and Minister, we're eager to hear your thoughts, and we invite you to continue the discussion.
Thank you very much, Camille. I hope you could all hear me.
Very good. Thank you very much to Camille. Hi, Jean. Good to see you. I hope you can hear me too.
Sounds like we have a go.
Very good.
So I'll take the first knock, if you don't mind, Ashley.
Sure. Please go ahead.
I think you're better second batter than I am, so I'll lead the way. So, Professor, thank you so very much. I think for outlining the whole mission-oriented concept of how one can go about achieving, I think, transformation, which is the entire theme of our conference. What I'd like to be able to do during this segment is to tease out a little some of the specifics that could relate, as it were, to developing countries. I know you've done some work on South Africa, but a large part of it has reflected the interaction with whether it is Britain or Italy or through the WHO, etc. And so I think it might be helpful by way of starting to have one preamble statement. I think what matters for me is developing countries like ours clearly face many, many more challenges than developed counterparts. And so whereas the framework you've identified clearly has held well in a developed country context, what we'd like to tease out of this conversation is what additional things need to be done, need to be taken into account to allow a developing country to, in principle, utilize that framework. So that's the context I think we would benefit from. And so maybe to start the ball rolling, let me ask one question, definitional question. How should we in a developing country context think of innovation, which I can think of as an outcome, and innovation policy, which probably is a facilitator of that outcome space? And should we be looking to distinguish public sector-led innovation versus private sector-led innovation, and innovation outcomes in a if you want, official market space versus an informal market space. We have lots of informal markets, incomplete markets that we struggle with on a day-to-day basis. And the existence of a market may not really exist. So that fundamental assumption may not actually hold. And so I'd love to hear your views on those dichotomies: formal, informal, private, public. How do we define innovation, innovation policy, and how we can bring those together in a way that I think the audience can really get a sense of what it is we are talking about first and foremost.
Sure, and thank you for that question, and also thank you so much again for having me. It's such an honor. So now, I might be wrong, and I don't want to sound, what's the word, cheeky or overconfident, but I feel that this approach is more relevant for developing countries in some ways than it is for developed. Why? The traditional approach, which I'm trying to kind of scrap, is one that says, oh, we need to invest in all these, great technological areas, whether it's quantum computing, renewable energy, particular agricultural, say, technologies. Now, you can expect that some developing countries will not have current capability or capacity in those areas. And so the question is, what does then a developing country do when, if we're framing industrial strategy and innovation policy as kind of tech or sector focused? If instead you reverse it, which is this mission approach, and say, focus on the problems. And as you just said, developing countries have a lot of problems, more problems, in the developmental trajectory, then actually the kind of sandbox, where one can start thinking about what are the kind of key challenges, what are the missions that then require all the different sectors, from mobility to nutrition to design, new design thinking to digital technologies, to come together to solve those problems, whether they be problems around climate or specifically around oceans or specifically around the digital divide, which I talked about, which is a huge problem in many developing countries. Personally, I think that's almost, I don't want to say an easier approach, but more natural approach for developing countries. And it's a way to also then, and this is the second point, if you then think about what does that mean, not just for the policy space, but the institutional space, I think that's the other really important point, which is, I'm from Italy, which is a country that has had for a century, I'd say, a very problematic relationship between the public and the private sector. The reason we have the mafia, which everyone in the world knows about because of the great movies, is because the state was so weak that you had self-help organizations in Sicily, the Società dei Beati Paoli, which ended up becoming Cosa Nostra. So the lack of the state actually formulated this huge informal economy. And one of the problems in Italy still today, and it's less sexy than the mafia, is that the state is sort of a parasitic state, right? It's a state that just kind of bails out companies, that gives out money to different types of sectors, which have a loud voice in terms of lobbying for asking for support. And by the way, Fiat, an automobile company, is not very innovative anymore and gets lots of support from the Italian government. So in countries that have what I would call a parasitic public-private ecosystem, this mission-oriented approach is extremely important because it puts, for example, conditionality at the core of the public-private relationship. So instead of just having a public bank, like in Italy, we have Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, giving out a loan to the steel sector just because it's having problems, putting conditionality that sector, and this would apply to any sector, whether it's tourism, aerospace, steel, that it has to transform in order to receive a public benefit. Transform in what? Towards a public objective, like around sustainability, like different issues around inclusion. That is, again, really important in countries that don't have, the right, if you want, design of state institutions, that might also have too much corruption, which, in my discussions with President Ramaphosa, we talk about all the time. That includes, by the way, when you have state-owned enterprises. So a state-owned enterprise is like Eskom in South Africa. How can it become part of the solution or not part of the problem? That means you even need public-public conditionality. It's not just public-private conditionality, public-public. So putting kind of that need to transform at the center of the public-private relationship, because the mission, the challenge is the focus versus just the handout to the sector, in my view, but I want to now stop talking so to hear more from you all, I think it's even more relevant in a developing country. And just lastly, because you talked about innovation policy, I mean, to me, this is innovation policy. Innovation policy can't just be, oh, fund more R&D. Of course, R&D is important. Of course, we know we need systems of innovation to foster science industry linkages, through the kind of Fraunhofer or Catapult kind of center, any sort of institution that fosters those science industry linkages. What we know less about, so I don't have to come tell you that you need, to spend more on research and development, education, science industry linkages. What I think we know much less about is how to make sure we then design those institutions in such a way that really are then catalytic and foster that kind of economy-wide and sector-wide transformation. And that's that kind of mission-oriented design of, for example, a public innovation agency focused on social problems where the technology then is a spillover along the way.
Thank you, Professor. Let me maybe just a quick follow-up before I allow Minister Singh to come in. The fact that we have that many more challenges means the hurdle rate is higher than, again, your typical developed country. Would mean ipso facto that presumably you have many more missions than you can genuinely handle at any one point in time. And since you are in a developing space, it also means you have a huge financial constraint. You cannot get your hands around all those big missions at any one point. So if you were to be advising a developing country, how would you convey the idea of limiting the number of missions that may be feasible? Or how do you prioritize among the many missions that might be worthy of entertainment? Or how do you sequence which one should be first versus second as a means of advancing that development space? And maybe how do you communicate that particular concept now to the people? Because they have to be able to understand, appreciate why some things are taking second fiddle, and do it in a way that is not just effective, but let's say transparent and accountable at the same time. I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that you may share?
Sure. So the first is to make sure, precisely to address your question, which is it's an excellent question again, is that we're not confusing missions with projects, right? I mean, one of the problems I find is that, in fact, I can show you here. I wrote Missione Italia for Giuseppe Conte, who was the prime minister previously, because in order to access the European Recovery Fund, which is the current, EU Next Gen Recovery Fund in Europe, every member state had to come up with a strategy. This is very different, a strategy around climate change and digitalization. Very different from the conditions attached to the European recovery after the financial crisis, where you might remember all the conditions were on austerity. It was reduce your deficit, keep it below 3%, and you might get some help. My experience in Italy in working with the mission approach was that instead of having this figure, which I had before on the slides, right, challenge, mission, sectors, projects, they were doing this, right? Which is exactly the problem that you're suggesting. It was raining down projects. It was just this huge wish list, a shopping list, where the sum of the projects is not greater, than the part. So the first thing is to say, at the challenge level, personally, I don't think we should rethink this. Every country, whether in the Caribbean, whether in Europe, whether in the US, different states have signed up to the SDGs. Those are the challenges. Transforming those into missions, which are concrete, that needs to be nested in local realities. But they need to be designed in a way that bring many different sectors together. But it doesn't mean making a shopping list of the projects. That's when you end up getting, drowning in too many different ideas, where, again, it doesn't amount to anything. So who decides the mission? I mean, that's one of the questions which you sort of asked, but it was sort of behind your question. I do sincerely think, coming to your last question about citizens and the communication, that the more we can start with the challenges, the SDG, turn those into missions in such a way that is nested also with citizen experience. So when I mentioned the work in London, that means bringing citizen assemblies to the table. So if housing estates, for example, social housing is one of the focuses of carbon neutral missions, what does it mean to bring people who are living in social housing to the table in co-creating and discussing and debating how we want to live together, right? But the main thing then from the government's viewpoint is, instead of just handing out a lot of money, and that's what creates the main problem you're suggesting, which is too much money is just being handed out and with very little prioritization. If you have this concept of conditionality and missions at the center of the loans, the grants, the procurement, the bailouts, the recovery, it actually is in many ways winnowing, making much more focused your investment space. Because you're, again, picking the willing, not just picking random lists of sectors, technologies, or types of firms.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting concept of whether it is joint responsibility or co-market, co-creation, co-designing, as it were, where all elements of society are, in a sense, participating. They own the particular mission, because the mission has to be sufficiently, I guess, perched at a reasonably high level that it doesn't get confused with the project set that would, in some sense, generate and yield the outcome of the bigger mission. But I think it's an important distinction, Professor, if you'd agree, that we should be keeping in mind, I think, as we go through that discourse. But with that, let me switch to Minister Singh. We cannot hear you. You are still muted.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jean. Can you hear me?
Got it. Yes.
Very good. So first of all, Jean, let me thank you very much for inviting me to join this very interesting presentation and panel. And Professor, thank you too for that excellent and very interesting, absolutely fascinating presentation. I must say that I found your lecture very relevant to some of the challenges that we have been contemplating for a number of years in the region, and I'm going to come back to why I say that in a minute. Issues related to transformation have been with us. The challenge of achieving lasting transformation in a variety of sectors, has been with us for a very long time. I found, in particular, your articulation on the mission-oriented approach to innovation and to achieving transformation, I think, very, very interesting. And I was particularly interested to hear Jean's question and your response to the applicability of this approach to developing countries. And I must say that based on my own initial thinking, your argument on the relevance of this approach to developing countries, I think, is one that appeals to me quite a lot. I agree with you that this sort of mission-based or mission-oriented approach to transformation, it does have some very obvious and appealing relevance in developing countries. I want though to go maybe one further step, because amongst the membership of the Caribbean Development Bank are not just developing countries, but small island development states, developing states, with the emphasis on small. And so amongst our membership, we have several countries who are really small, probably populations of less than 250,000, in some cases even less than that, populations of less than 100,000. So very small populations, relatively limited human and natural resources, limited opportunities for productive diversification, which has been a challenge that we've faced for a very long time. And in fact, the transformation of our productive sector from a mono-sectoral economy, from an economy dominated in most countries by tourism, to a more diversified productive sector. This has been one of the challenges that we've been wrestling with for a long time. And so while Jean spoke of the challenges faced by developing countries I'd like perhaps for a minute or two to focus on, I guess we could call them challenges or the peculiar characteristics, I guess, of small countries, like the small countries in the Caribbean, and there are quite a few of them in the Pacific as well, who would be, I guess, in similar circumstances. Given the extremely small populations, the limited human and natural resources, like I said earlier, the limited obvious opportunities for diversification, which is something that people like to overcome. Small domestic markets, oftentimes remote distance from our major trading partners, and a reality of extremely limited fiscal space. Given the realities that are faced, those and other similar realities that are faced by the small developing countries of regions like the Caribbean and the Pacific, can I ask what your thoughts are on how you see these characteristics, the reality and the realities and accompanying factors associated with smallness, how you see these characteristics affecting the innovative potential of these countries, and what your thoughts are on harnessing innovative potential in settings like this, where countries are really very small and domestic or in-house or indigenous capacity is really extremely limited.
So very challenging and relevant question. I mean, you, in some ways, I think you, I don't want to say answered it, but you framed it in such a way that is really important, which is given the problems, right? Very small market size, very poor, often connectivity and different types of linkages in the economy, lack of economic diversification, an aging population, which, that's the strange bit that actually often connects developed and some underdeveloped countries in terms of an aging population, which at the same time has very high unemployment amongst the youth. These are all areas that in some ways are starving for a mission-oriented approach, but it's not easy. I don't want to just become like it shouldn't be a soundbite. It should be a way to focus on the problems. For example, the aging population in many of these islands. What would it look like to actually bring to the problem of aging the power of, say, digitalization, right? As again, in that kind of general purpose technology kind of way, but where digital services, whether we're talking about digital services for climate oriented things or an aging population oriented problems, that becomes a funnel through which one can also then at the level of government capacity. So again, reorienting our procurement policies so that they're really procuring in innovative solutions for particular populations that are experiencing particular problems. I guess what I'm arguing is that personally I find a much more effective, because that is what got us to the moon, right? I mean, when we think about the moon landing, we shouldn't think, oh, that's just because it was the space race, that was the military industrial complex. That's not what made it special. What made it special was that they treated it with urgency. They definitely threw money at it, but it was a problem-oriented task. All those spillovers that I talked about would never have happened had they worried about those technologies. The internet would not have happened had we said, oh, we need the internet, let's invest in it. The internet solved a problem, which was to get the satellites to communicate. GPS solved a problem, which was to know where the hell the ships were in the ocean for the Navy, which basically invested in GPS. So at that kind of small island level that you're talking about, I mean, I guess I'm throwing back the question to you in some ways. Where do you find that the bottlenecks have been? Because surely there hasn't been lack of attempt to develop, to digitalize, to confront unemployment, to bring in FDI. I mean, would you agree that one of the problems has been that the unit of analysis, that what we have focused on has been wrong, and that the problems that you kind of outlined that these islands are facing hasn't been the focus of the industrial strategy? I mean, what I see in so many countries is that the discussion about industrial strategy, innovation policy, terms like wealth creation are in one room, and in the other room, we worry about inequality, social services, taxation, problems of unemployment. What I'm arguing is these two rooms have to come together. So all those problems around the welfare state and social services and services to the elderly and services for children and to mothers who've just had children, they can become funnels for the innovation itself. And so one of the problems is that, especially in countries where the kind of traditional categories that we think about with innovation, research and development, technological change, if that capacity isn't there, then that's where, you know, there's a huge problem. Whereas if you say the focus has to be on solving the problems and then aligning all these different instruments in order to solve the problem. Let me just give you a quick example. I mean, this isn't in a small island at all, but in Brazil, I started to work with the development bank there, BNDES, a long time ago. And I found that it was only when they had a national priority around inequality that the bank actually started to really change how it was interacting with companies. So at the time, they had all these companies that were producing generic drugs, and there was global multinationals, the Pfizers of the world, that were buying up these companies, keeping the Brazilian name, so it looked like there was diversification, but it was actually a kind of an eating up of these small providers. And so these small companies went to the bank and said, help, give us money so we can retain our kind of Brazilian, not only nationality, but still survive without being bought up. And because the strategy at the high level was inclusive, innovation-led growth, they created a strong condition for the companies that then stimulated innovation that they otherwise wouldn't have done. They said, why are you producing generic drugs where people have to take the medicine 5 times a day? If you live in a favela and are very poor, you're not going to remember, because your life is often very disrupted, to take 5 pills a day. So in order to access the loan, they had to produce a generic drug where it was just 1 pill a day. And it's a very kind of small example, but I think it's very interesting, which is that if you're focused on inclusive growth, if you have the citizen at the center of your mind, then how the bank lends to a generic drug manufacturer is citizen-centered and forces the company to innovate, to invest and innovate in order to solve that problem. And
Professor, can I?
Yeah.
Sure.
Let me come in here, because I think the question that the minister posed is not only pertinent, it is critical. Maybe we could say the goal that we will all aspire to, and I think you alluded to it, is, let's say, sustainable, inclusive growth. Let's leave that, we can agree on that. But then if we say, what would be the appropriate mission that we could embrace, we could say, this is what we want to be able to move. I think, and I'm going to just test this out there, one thing we could probably agree on is resilience. And I'll tell you why I say resilience, because maybe one of the characteristics of those small island states that Minister mentioned is the fact that we have a different response, different reaction, different rate of recovery when an event occurs than happens in your normal, even developing, as opposed to even a developed country space. So you could say you'd need to focus on a mission of how do we build resilience. And that resilience, because it has to be all-encompassing as a mission, would suggest you need to have resilience on, let's say, social policy, the education and the health that you spoke of. You'd need to have resilience in, let's say, the environment, whether it's markets or natural disasters, climate, renewables, that sort of resilience you'd want. You'd also want to have resilience in, say, things like institutional capacity development, because if you don't have the ability to withstand maybe just a migration shock of people leaving the system, or the public sector cannot attract the appropriate number of people, the capacity goes, you really cannot build back. But, and I'm just going to maybe stop on those 3, leave even the economic resilience of trade shocks and price shocks, whether it is oil or, you know, a pandemic shock hitting you. Small states or atomistic states. Ashley was talking of 100,000. A lot of our people don't have 100,000. It's much, much smaller than that. Okay. How do they manage a mission, hold resolutely to a mission without the means to effect that mission financially, or even what sort of innovation policies we are talking about that can potentially help them go across. And that was maybe the angle I was looking for when I talked about prioritization, sequencing, because you probably have to chop it and then maybe hold on to one mission at a time, a significant mission that probably has the most bang for the buck. I don't know, it sounds like the problem is almost insurmountable when you put it in big space, but I'm sure there has to be a way. And that's where we'd really want to hear your input here. There has to be a way of how do you dissect it, separate it, bring it down into sizable chunks that you can then say, this is the entire focus that will yield that mission, and bring in all the different pieces, the sectors and so on, the projects, to be able to achieve that mission.
So, I mean, let's just take a very concrete example. I mean, many of these small islands that the minister was talking about obviously live to a large extent on tourism. If you can break down different parts of the tourism industry and have an overall, if you want, umbrella over tourism that would actually have very concrete metrics around it being a kind of a green, sustainable, social and physical infrastructure, so that the kind of carbon neutral type metrics that we have with global warming are nested within the kind of investments that we need for a healthy, sustainable tourism industry. I mean, that's kind of the umbrella bit, right? The portfolio investment, because I really believe that if you end up putting all your eggs in one basket, you're kind of setting yourself up for a lack of resilient, if you want, economy. So if you have a portfolio space, and I've often argued that we need to not think about kind of, public banks or public funds in particular areas of lenders of last resort, but actually investors of first resort. What does it look like to create a portfolio of investments that are trying to tilt the playing field in an economy, and specifically in this case, it could be, achieving, I don't know, whatever metrics your policymakers would think would be relevant in terms of making sure that your tourism industry is both innovative and green. It's that level, I think, of design change that we need, because that's very different from having, say, a public fund that is just kind of handing out money to different types of entities that are in the tourism sector. When you have strong ambitions and criteria and targets around what you mean, and again, I'm not an expert in tourism, so I'd ask your own experts on what those examples might be, but that becomes the way that then you set up a mission around tourism that is very targeted, where you can actually say yes or no, did you achieve it, on whether it is, again, sustainable and green, and whether your own financial tools are able to set up portfolios that are able to crowd in, and I think that's fundamental, crowd in different types of initiatives, which, by the way, some will fail. One of the, I once got a call actually by Gaston Brown. It was quite funny because my daughter answered the phone and said, the Prime Minister called. I was like, which Prime Minister? And he had talked to me at the time about something that he was thinking about, which was tourism, again, not only the green side, but how can we actually set up structures that ensure that we're socializing through these public, benefits that are often given to the tourism industry, both the risks and the rewards. So whether it's retaining, equity stakes, whether it's setting up some sort of public wealth fund, which then recoups some of the profits that are not just extracted out to large hotel chains, to then, reinvest back into the sector to always push the frontier of the sector to be as innovative and sustainable as possible. And that again requires a kind of, institutional design change from ones that we currently have. And, this comes back to that kind of pre-distribution point that I made during the lecture, which is thinking about inequality and social goals, not just ex post after we've made a mess of it, but actually embedding, and this is why I gave that example with BNDES, embedding within the loan program itself, embedding within that public-private investment and subsidy that might be given to a sector within a small, medium, or large country, the ambitions to actually achieve particular targets, but also to share in the profits right? So socializing both risks and rewards through all sorts of different ways that one could do that, including, again, setting up wealth funds as part of the process.
Minister.
I think
Okay,
We
so
can hear you. Yeah.
I think now we want to broaden the discussion and bring in our audience, both on our conference platform and also on our social media sites. You have an opportunity now, those of you joining us online, to pose your questions. You can make your submissions via the conference platform or the chat feature on our social media platforms. And we ask you to keep your questions brief. There is a hot discussion happening now on YouTube, and so we will go there first. How can developing countries use the mission-driven model to drive new investment in SDG goals? Professor, I'm going to direct that one at you.
Isn't that what we've been talking about the whole time? Sorry, I think I missed the concreteness of the question. How can we use innovation policy towards SDGs?
Yeah, if you could give us three things.
Yeah. I mean, those examples. Yeah, I mean, just take all the SDGs. They are all very broad challenges. Turning them into, missions, whether it's around gender parity, that clean oceans one that I gave. If you just stop there, just like had Kennedy stopped at the space race, nothing would have happened. The problem with the SDGs is we've stopped at that kind of space race level, the no poverty, no hunger, gender parity, and often haven't turned the challenges into goals like, getting 90% of the plastic out of the ocean in 5 years. That then becomes the metric through which you actually judge your public policy. That becomes the funnel through which you do your industrial strategy and your innovation policy. In Europe, it was 100 carbon neutral cities across the European region. That was not just seen as a social kind of program, that was seen as fundamental to the Horizon program, which was the innovation budget. And so, in any area, I actually don't see this as a small, medium, or large country problem. Every country is signed up to the SDGs, bringing, as we were talking about with Dr. Leon, different also types of communities and stakeholders together to nest the SDGs in a local context. But the important thing is then to transform those targets to the center of the economy, as opposed to remaining on the periphery around just kind of social impact kind of areas. It becomes the way you do your industrial strategy, the way you do your innovation policy.
Okay, the region has been said to suffer from an implementation deficit. How would the suggested approach assist us in resolving that deficit?
Well, I think there's a self-fulfilling prophecy that the more we think that the state is not able, whether it's due to corruption, whether it's due to nepotism, whether it's just due to lack of capacity, sometimes talent, sometimes funds, and the more we then rely on other actors, whether they be philanthropies, World Bank type institutions, consulting companies, institutions, it's not that they shouldn't be involved in the process. Of course, they should be, but the more that we are underinvesting within the public sector, this was one of the points I kind of focused on, in order to actually develop what I call the dynamic capabilities of the public sector. For example, actually having the capability to use something like procurement, which is a tool every country has. There's no lack of procurement in any country. It's just often done in a static way. The more we can actually invest in the capacity to develop innovative strategies around procurement, for example, the more we develop the experience on the ground within state institutions themselves, which then that kind of learning by doing happens. And also by actually talking about the public sector as co-creating and not just fixing, it actually makes it also more interesting to be a civil servant. If all the talk is that the risk-taking is in the business sector, and at best the public sector is there to de-risk the interesting, creative, businesses, of course, a lot of the young, talent will prefer to go work in business. So bringing, crowding in the talent within the civil service is, I think, a huge issue that needs to be discussed, but it's not going to be done with the status quo thinking of what the public sector is for.
Is good governance a precondition for mission-oriented framework?
Of course. But what are the metrics, right? I mean, one of the problems with the discussions about governance is sometimes we've brought in metrics from the private sector, so private sector notions of efficiency into the public sector. And so almost turn the public sector into a inefficient private sector because, it actually isn't set up like the private sector, as opposed to having its own metrics. I just did a study with the BBC, for example. As a public institution, it has had for decades its own criteria around public value. The strong notion of public value within the BBC that many private providers don't have, but also many public providers don't have, because they're simply almost trying to copy the private sector broadcasters. So the BBC has dared to go into programs like, talk shows and soap operas, which in theory it shouldn't do if it's just fixing markets. In theory, if you're just fixing the market problem, you should be doing documentaries and high quality news, what PBS does in the US. What the BBC did was it dared to go into soap operas and made the soap opera about the working class, EastEnders, instead of just Dallas and Dynasty. So pushing the frontier of what we even mean by, public broadcasting, investing within its own institution and having these strong metrics around public value to both help it decide what to do, but also how to do it, and then to evaluate whether it achieved its public purpose. We don't have enough of those metrics, which means that we often end up with lazy public institutions that are just kind of ditching out money, helicopter money, into different areas without strong governance principles.
Are there any concrete examples in the developing world where the mission-oriented approach has been applied, and what were the results?
Yeah, I just did a study actually with Inter-American Development Bank looking at countries like Colombia, where they had a very concrete mission around in a specific city. And by the way, cities are often, I find, in the kind of front line of interesting mission-oriented approaches. So Medellin, a city in Colombia, had Medellin más educada, so making Medellin the most educated, the kind of education-focused city. And it was very interesting what it actually meant in terms of bringing together different public, private, civil society organizations around particular educational projects, which were, again, nested within particular places like social housing and youth centers, similar in some ways to the Camden project that I was mentioning. But so it was both fostering more investment in education as a sector, but seeing education as kind of a platform through which it was solving some very, very concrete place-based problems in the city. And again, I think what made it important was it was done through, again, an industrial/innovation, social innovation strategy lens versus just kind of a social services a prism. And again, I really find that some of the most interesting examples are through that. In South Africa, I think a very interesting problem right now is, in fact, for its own green transition, how do you make sure that instead of just seeing the existing, and it's not me saying it, it's the kind of, what everyone talks about in South Africa, that the state is so weak, how do you strengthen the state through its mission building so that its own green transition strategy isn't just, again, mission focused in terms of the kind of carbon neutral type missions you might have in an area, but also that change in the institutional design that I keep kind of coming back to. So what does it actually mean for the remit of a state-owned enterprise in terms of its relationship to the treasury, where it's getting a lot of its kind of funds, if missions are at the focus of its existence, instead of it just being kind of a place where power relations and incumbency kind of effects are housed. And so I think what's currently happening in South Africa on that front is quite interesting. In no way perfect, but it's definitely a trajectory where it's going. But, missions, we shouldn't make this word seem like it's like this, big thing. Missions are problems that need to be solved, but not projects. They're problems that require lots of sectors. So, Denmark, you might think it's not relevant, but Denmark is a tiny country. Yes, it's in the developed world, but because it actually had a startup strategy in Copenhagen with many small companies that weren't just being invested in, like in many countries where it's just like, oh, let's invest in startups as though that's a thing in itself. They said, let's allow these startups to scale up by helping, in that case, it was Copenhagen, be one of the greenest cities in Europe. They ended up developing, for example, really interesting digital green services. And Denmark, a tiny country, is today the #1 provider of green, digital, high-tech services to China, which is spending, $3 trillion basically on greening its entire manufacturing base. And it's not because Denmark was rich that it did it. In fact, Sweden hasn't done it. Norway hasn't done it. It was interesting because it all happened through kind of a startup strategy in a city, which locally try to be the greenest city in Europe, and yes, funded the startups, but through a scaling up kind of funnel, precisely through those kinds of tools that I keep going back to, like procurement, which is kind of a boring tool compared to, say, venture capital, and yet it ends up being a really important scaling up funnel.
Absolutely. Now, besides voting, how can ordinary citizens be more involved in electing officials or moving elected officials to more sustainable innovation policies? What can we, the people, do?
Well, it's interesting, and I come back to that picture of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that I had up there close to the French finance minister, and I had them up there because they had both done. Well, one looked a bit more dynamic than the other, but still the French finance minister was the one who brought that conditionality right at the center of the bailouts during the COVID-19 moment to both aerospace and automobiles. But what, AOC did, I think, was really bring herself into the kind of public debate, because she, really focused on the Green Deal and actually defined it. She focused as much on the deal bit as on the green bit. Very much in the spirit of what I've been talking about. The deal is about how do we get business and the state to work together in a fundamentally different way, a less parasitical way, a more symbiotic, mutualistic way. And she just had a really inspirational way, I think, to talk about it, and, became kind of a superstar, if you want, in the US. But what does it mean not just to become a superstar and to talk the talk, but really to make sure that the kind of politicians that we are developing, but also that we are then voting for and creating movements around them, are ones that are helping us kind of change the narrative. It's how many people do you hear saying, "Oh, politicians, they're all corrupt," or it's all that's not where the action's at. The action's in, again, like I mentioned before, the venture capital space. There's all sorts of excitement and dynamism, but actually, what we really need is new thinking, but also creativity. As Obama said in that slide that I put, he said that we haven't reinvented government since the age of black and white TV. This kind of mixing of having ambitious policies, but also getting concrete on how those policies will never work unless we invest within our structures, within government, to be as innovative and interesting as the policies that we're going for themselves. And I think the more we can vote for politicians that are committed to actually changing the apparatus, the machinery of government, and not just talking the talk of big ideas, the more change we're going to see. And for that to happen, though, we have to be willing to experiment. So that's where we have problems, because as soon as you experiment, you might make mistakes. So I think what citizens need is to be a bit more forgiving that mistakes are natural. You will not know how to ride a bike if you don't fall off. However, if we're not making investments within government to learn from those mistakes, so we're just failing and not learning by doing, that itself is also a problem. But one of the biggest problems is the fear of failure, the fear of risk-taking within our government institutions. So getting a bit more narrative so citizens realize that we need to also allow a space, an experimentation space, also for policymaking. I think that is very important.
So technological innovation tends to reduce the involvement of human resources. How do we balance innovation with the gaps created by unemployment using the mission concept in developing countries?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's just for developing countries. I mean, the problems of how technological change is often labor displacing is something that already David Ricardo, one of the first economists, wrote about back in the 1800s. He had a chapter, by the way, called On Machinery in the first ever textbook called Principles of Political Economy. And in there, he was looking precisely at what many people are talking about today, how robotics and artificial intelligence are basically, taking away many different employment opportunities and reducing wages. But then what we had for about 150 years was a system, a corporate governance system, coming back to the early part of my talk, that made sure in some ways that the profits that were being created were actually reinvested back into the economy. And something I've been writing about for a long time is that when that cycle stopped, when we had this obsession of maximizing shareholder value in many companies and engaging in things like, it's not the only example, share buyback schemes, that kind of value extraction that wasn't reinvested back into research and development, human capital formation, training of workers, that hurt workers much more than the technological change itself, because as long as the profits were being reinvested, mechanization caused labor displacement in one area, but then new jobs in another area. And that's why the global trade union movement, I think, has been very active around this concept of the just transition, which is that, as we transition to a greener economy, but also a more digitalized economy, we have to be investing in the workforce to transition and to adapt to those changes. But often those skills that workers have had in the past were also developed not just through government training programs, but also within companies. So companies, coming back to this conditionality issue that I keep bringing up, should be investing within the workforce to transition as those companies themselves are becoming, say, more innovative and sustainable. And that should also be at the heart of how they receive public funds. Companies must be investing in human capital, and if not, they're part of the problem, not part of the solution.
So, gentlemen, we've been deferring to the lady, but we have you two in the hot seat, so we want to bring you onto the playing field. Minister, I'm going to put this one to you. Regional integration. How do you see that contributing to innovation? Can we innovate and move forward by coming together?
Absolutely. Well, in fact, Camille, I'm glad that you chose to put that one to me, because it's actually one that I feel very, very strongly about. And it's in fact related to the point that I made earlier about the challenges of smallness. For a long time, I have believed, and I believe many of us in the region have believed, that regional integration actually offers one of the avenues with greatest potential for us to overcome the challenges of our smallness. I think it goes without saying that to the extent that we achieve a more rapid, more accelerated regional integration, we would be operating in a larger economic space. We would overcome the challenges of the smallness of our domestic markets, etc. Some of the things that we spoke about, and that both Professor and President Leon spoke about earlier when I made the point of smallness. And so there's no doubt at all in my mind, and I believe there's no doubt at all in the leadership, that regional integration certainly holds a lot of potential as far as, first of all, overcoming the challenges of smallness of our individual domestic markets, and also being better able to harness the potential of the region. It's interesting that the point is mentioned, because I think one of your earlier comments spoke about the implementation deficit that has plagued the region. And in fact, I think there are few areas where there has been an implementation deficit that's more visible than in relation to the regional integration movement. For a long time, we've been aspiring, well, as you know, we have a customs union. We have some elements of a single market and economy, but for a long time we've been lamenting the pace with which we've been moving towards actually achieving what's described in the region as the CSME, the Caribbean or CARICOM Single Market and Economy. And so, in fact, it is on the regionalization agenda that I think we see an implementation deficit perhaps more visibly than anywhere else. And I think as a region, certainly I would say, in Guyana, we take our regional obligations very seriously. We believe that broadening the economic space has a lot of potential to be, or will help us to unleash a lot of potential. And I think will also help us, I think, to the extent that we are able to achieve more progress on the regional integration front, I think creates an opportunity for us to consider the question of the region's mission and/or mission projects in a more holistic way. And so issues like avoidance of duplication, specializing in that which we're best able to do, as you know, even within the region, we're not a homogeneous region. Guyana, the commodity producers in the region are different from the tourism-based economies. We have economies like Guyana and Suriname and Trinidad that are more commodity-based. We have the tourism-based economies. And I think to the extent that we're able to accelerate the integration effort, we will be able to approach the question of identifying what our regional mission is, or what our shared missions are, what our shared mission projects are, and conceptualizing the task before us in a mission-oriented approach, I think has a lot of, I think, it's going to be considerably more easier, or considerably easier. Before I leave this question of regional integration, I would say, though, that even beyond regional integration in the CARICOM sense, we in Guyana take very seriously also the potential for regional integration in a more hemispheric context. And in this regard, the fact that we are on mainland South America, the fact that we are contiguous to Suriname and contiguous to Brazil in the south, and Brazil in the south, and Venezuela in the west, also creates quite a lot of potential from the point of view of hemispheric integration and being better able to enlarge the market space in which we operate, and by in doing so, overcome some of the challenges, the smallest that I alluded to earlier. So I'm really glad that you put that one on the agenda. It's something that I would very happily speak on for a very long time, but I don't want to. I know you probably have lots of other questions. If time permits, I'd be happy to come back to it. But that's an initial reaction that I would offer.
But Chair, can I enter here? I have a question actually building on this that I'd love to hear Professor Mazzucato's opinion on, because I don't think I have the answer myself. Ashley made the point about using a common joint mission approach to cement our regional integration efforts. And while this would be, and I wholeheartedly would support that as something we should look for, it becomes super important now as you move to one level down in terms of the projects that will actually generate the outcome of that mission. How do you take into account the lack of convergence or the wide diversity that we have, the heterogeneity of initial conditions? What might be the tools we would need to consider to literally either provide more distributive elements to some to help that project going, or do you need to come up with other tools of allowing maybe countries to implement projects at different levels so that we can at least have those performance indicators, in a sense, dictate whether we have or have not met? And I think it's a big problem, in as much as I think that regional ideal is something we cannot do without. It would become a problem we would need to think a lot about as to how we actually engineer it to get us there. I don't know, Professor, if you've done a lot of work on the EU. I know it's not as wide in heterogeneity, but maybe you might have some ideas here.
It's very wide in heterogeneity. And in fact, it's the disaster in the EU that they didn't, that the heterogeneity that exists was diagnosed in the wrong way. The idea was, oh, the southern, what Goldman Sachs called the pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. I'm allowed to say that because I'm Italian. If a German calls Italian, no, that's going to be a disaster. Yeah. So it was seen for such a long time that the peripheral, southern periphery countries had simply kind of spent too much money. Their public budgets had somehow been inflated. It was completely false. Italy's deficit has been lower than Germany's deficit for years. Germany, however, has been investing on both public and private in all the long-run drivers of GDP growth. So even though its deficit is higher, its debt to GDP is lower, right? When you have exactly those kind of parasitic relationships that I talked about before between public and private, which I find exists both in countries like Italy, but also with some of my colleagues in Africa, when they tell me what's happening in their countries, it's very similar in terms of how the state interacts with business. Then, growth, if you want, stops. So one of the things that we really fail to do in Europe is exactly what Minister Singh was talking about, which is how do we actually not only have a common project around really, ambitious missions around the example I had given on my slide was 100 carbon neutral European cities by 2030, getting all these different sectors, et cetera, together, but actually learning from each other what works and what doesn't in terms of the state itself. So Italy doesn't have the science industry linkages like the Fraunhofer Institutes. We don't have vocational training, like they have in the German workforce. We don't have an ambitious innovation-led public bank like the KfW. So what you could have had regionally was a true learning platform of kind of what works, what doesn't. Italy, by the way, has lots of things besides food that's much better than Germany. We're one of the most innovative, for example, around school nurseries, 0 to 3-year-old education. That itself could have been something that Italy offered, again, other European member states. And that didn't happen, because the focus was on kind of growth for growth's sake, and then looking at the countries that weren't growing and making accusations about that it was all about their kind of, too much spending. We lost the opportunity to actually restructure Europe, both around common objectives, but also that kind of learning, trial and error in terms of institutional capacity to strengthen the state, which remains very, very weak in many European countries. So I really like what you said, Minister Singh, in terms of a kind of regional, but also kind of, an ambition around with your neighbors to both maybe have common projects around, again, SDGs around climate, but especially about learning from each other. Like that example I gave of the BNDES public bank, it has actually changed over time a lot, how it's worked. It used to actually also be much more problematic, if you want, than it is now. So that learning, that history, that case study, just like Harvard Business School has case studies at the private sector level, we need case study at the public sector institutional capacity level to learn.
Professor, I think we'll have to have you back. I really think we don't have enough time, and it is enlightening and invigorating and inspiring to engage on this level. And we thank you very much. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, President. We really hate to draw it to a close, and it's no easy task to sum up or summarize the ideas and concepts we have explored this morning. But the CDB's Vice President Operations, Isaac Solomon, will take up the challenge, and he will deliver the closing remarks. Isaac, the virtual podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Camille. Thank you, Professor Mariana Mazzucato. This is my first William G. Demas Memorial Lecture experience, and it has been an extremely thought-provoking and inspiring engagement. And I'm very sure you would all agree that we have gained a deeper understanding of the essential role of innovation and how instrumental it is in supporting the COVID-19 recovery. The CDB believes that it is absolutely vital for the region to embrace innovation as a tool for igniting economic growth and development. We have utilized this year's William G. Demas Memorial Lecture to kindle that process, and Professor Mazzucato was the ideal person to lay a framework for exploring novel ideas. We knew we needed a voice like hers to spark new thinking on these issues as we contemplate the future for our region post-COVID-19. Professor Mazzucato is known for her groundbreaking ideas about shaping policy to address the challenges facing humanity and for contesting conventional theories about the forces that drive innovation and create economic value. We appreciate the multifaceted approach that allowed us to hear her thoughts and ideas, and also enabled us to relate the issues and ideas to our regional context. Of course, she provided an excellent snapshot for our current reality. She pivoted to the problems in the corporate sector, where she said that there's a focus on short-termism, which is manifested in, for example, shareholder value. But she challenged that notion for the corporate sector to switch to a shareholder focus. She also pointed out the problems in government, where the role of the state is inherently framed in inertia, with little room for proactive action and an over-reliance on outsourcing too much of the state's role to the private sector. And here she is challenging us to build capabilities within the public sector instead. We heard concepts such as value creation versus value extraction, the mission-oriented approach, which she is warning us not to use as a soundbite, but to focus on our problems. We heard about how we can reorient our economies to embrace citizen co-creation. She gives us an idea of how we can redesign the social contract by putting conditionalities at the center of bailout schemes. It was also good to hear the perspectives of CDB's president, Dr. Leon, and Minister Singh from Guyana, who are both intimately acquainted with the challenges the region faces and also committed to finding solutions to bring growth, social development, and prosperity to the Caribbean. Ladies and gentlemen, this is just the start of the discussion about how we can use innovation to reimagine our future. We must continue the conversation in our schools, universities, businesses, homes, churches, and all the other spaces where we gather. And perhaps, most importantly, we must move from discussion to effective action. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isaac. Thank you very much, Professor Mazzucato. It really was a privilege and a pleasure having you deliver this year's William G. Demas Lecture. Thank you, President Jean Leon. It was good to hear your thoughts on these issues, and we know we'll be hearing a lot more from you as our annual meeting continues. Thank you, Minister Singh. We always have to put things in the context of this region that we live in, work in, and love, and we thank you for bringing that Caribbean perspective to the discussions. Ladies and gentlemen, this morning's lecture marks the start of the CDB's annual meeting. Next on the agenda is our webinar entitled Reimagining Caribbean Economies in the Wake of the COVID-19 Pandemic. That will be held on Thursday, June 17 at 10 a.m. AST. This event will also be streamed live on our social media platforms. Please join us then. For the full schedule of our annual meeting events, visit our website or our social media platforms. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you will stay with us for the 3-week duration of our annual meeting events. We have a lot more in store. The conversation is just started. Let's keep it going. Thank you.